Okay, authorities right around the world are cracking down on vaping. There are now more than 1,000 people in the U.S. alone with lung injuries thought to be linked to vaping, and doctors say more are likely to come. They admit they don't know exactly what it is that's making people sick. The CDC says 78% of patients said they vaped the active marijuana ingredient, THC. 17% only used nicotine. Now, New York and Massachusetts both have tried to implement bans of those flavored vaping products. Meanwhile, electronic cigarettes were banned in India last month, and in China, Juul found that its products were removed from online marketplaces. But no official explanation was given. Now, we have more just in from New York University researchers that have found that e-cigarette vapor causes cancer in mice. Now, they conclude that it's very harmful to humans as well. One question is, why didn't we see all of this coming? Naomi Oreskes is the author of the new book, Why Trust Science, and professor of history of science. Again, it's a professor of the history of science at Harvard University, and she joins me now. I think it's an important distinction because, you know, you've pointed out that whenever you were trying to really present a scientific argument, people would still approach you and say, how do you know what you know about science? As if science is still being manipulated, as if it's fiction. Why do you think this has been a problem, especially when it comes to issues like vaping?
Well, it's been a problem with controversial issues like vaping because the scientific community has faced large-scale organized efforts to undermine and discredit science. And the tobacco industry is really #1 culprit in this area. We knew that tobacco caused cancer at least as far back as the 1950s. Some people would argue earlier. But the tobacco industry over decades, many decades, ran a campaign deliberately designed to discredit the science and to confuse the American people about what we really knew about tobacco.
But what did we miss here on vaping? And, you know, I had to point it out to the young people on our show who said that they also believe that the current data is alarmist. They say that there aren't that many cases, perhaps, and that the science that they see isn't definitive enough.
Well, this is the argument that we face all the time. And of course, one of the problems that scientists face is that in the early days of a problem, in the early days of an epidemic, anytime someone tries to draw attention to it, they can be accused of being alarmist. If right now there's maybe only 1,000 cases of people affected by vaping, but eventually if this isn't controlled, it will be a much, much larger number than that. And of course, what I always say is if the house is on fire, you need to pull the alarm.
And people seem reluctant to. You know, this debate started in terms of you presenting it this way. You cut your teeth on the climate issue, and it's a treacherous topic for sure. You know, you first noticed that discontent that people were feeling, as if they wanted to dispute the science because they felt that it was far too alarmist. What have we learned in the last 20 years when it comes to climate and trying to use the indisputable science to basically inform policy?
Well, sometimes, I'm sorry to say, it feels like we haven't learned anything because it seems like we have to keep repeating the same messages over and over and over again. But I think one thing that we have definitely learned that my work shows and other people is that scientists are not alarmists. If anything, it's the opposite. Most scientists are very cautious people. Science as an enterprise tends to be quite conservative. And scientists typically don't really speak clearly on an issue until they have huge volumes of information, often actually much more information than ordinary people would expect in their own lives. And in the specific case of climate, we now can show without any doubt that actually, if we look back on climate science, that not only were scientists not alarmists, but actually they understated the threat. And today we see climate change and many of its related parameters happening faster than scientists predicted, and many of the consequences and impact being greater than scientists predicted.
It's interesting, you know, though I still feel as if the public seems very confused even when you use the word science. I'll give you an example. This week we had this controversy over whether or not red meat is good for you or not good for you. And people were pointing to, you know, studies in either direction. Why is it? Why is it that we cannot discern science and look at it and say, look, the arrows are pointing in a certain direction here?
Well, there's two things, and one, I hate to say this to you because you're a journalist, but I feel like journalists really contributed tremendously. Yeah, this last week was not the high moment of journalism, in my opinion. One of the things we know about science, and that I talk about at great length in my book, is that science works to build bodies of evidence. We don't come to scientific conclusions based on any one person's opinion, and we don't come to scientific conclusions based on any one study, even a study that seems to be perhaps very good. So journalists ran this week with this story about the beef. It was all over the newspapers, big headlines, maybe meat is okay after all. And it was one study in a landscape filled with thousands of really, really rigorous, good studies that tell us that eating a lot of meat is not good for us. So I think journalists really did the public a disservice there. And then the other important part
I have to cut you off there. I have to cut you off there, but as long as you promise to come back, because of course we all want to learn better about how to better report the science, which will get us going in the right direction here. Professor Oreskes, thanks so much.
Definitely.
Really appreciate it.